Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Law Zebra Network. We're here today to talk about consumer debt and specifically Illegal Collection Practices Act. My name is Bob Welsenbach. I'm a lawyer in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and we're joined today with Scott Borson. Scott, could you just introduce yourself for us?
Sure. Hi, I live in California. I practice in California and Maryland and District of Columbia. I'm licensed in all three places, and I also have cases across the country on consumer issues. I've been practicing consumer law for the last 30 years, and I'm part of the Law Zebra Network.
Scott, let's, before we start talking about specific consumer debt and what's illegal, could you give us an idea, what is Law Zebra Network, what's the purpose of it, and what's the ultimate goal of Law Zebra Network?
What I have found is across the country, there's not enough consumer lawyers. So I get a lot of contact from people across the country asking for help in their particular states. And I'm not licensed to practice everywhere. So I've developed this network of attorneys across the country so that consumers can have access to an attorney who understands the consumer issues and can help them with it. And so the goal is to cover all 50 states eventually, but really to make an attorney who knows consumer law available to everyone who needs one in every state.
Great. And could you just give us a little bit more background about yourself? What is it that got you involved in doing consumer cases, and what makes you passionate about helping out consumers?
Well, I think the answer to that is, everything's a product of your history. And, when I was growing up, we had tough financial times and saw the effect that improper practices would have on a family and just the stress and everything else involved in dealing with financial issues when you don't have enough money necessarily to pay the bills. So that probably started me on the path. And then after I started practicing in this area, I realized how I could help people, and that a lot of the things that people might think are, just the way it is and the way it has to be is wrong, that there are consumer laws that protect people, and they're designed to help you get through these things.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about the first topic, which we're going to talk about, which is debt buyers. Can you give us an idea? What is a debt buyer? How does that industry work? And what are some of the issues and problems that presents for the typical consumer?
Sure. The debt buying industry is relatively new, basically maybe late 80s, early 90s. And in the past, creditors, if they had a situation where they couldn't collect on a debt or it became uncollectible because of the time, those debts would just go away. And now there's an entire industry that goes in and buys these debts. They pay, the average according to the FTC is about 4 cents on the dollar, but then they turn around and try to collect the full dollar from the consumers. So they're buying these debts in bulk. I mean, it's not like they buy your particular debt if you owe a couple $1,000s. What they're doing is buying literally millions of dollars of debts. And you might have seen, and this extends to everything, credit card debts, medical debts, all of these debts are being bought. And then they're turning around and suing people. And what they're doing is they sue people in court. So a lot of lay people, you get sued by someone, you see a name that you never heard of. And some people think, well, I don't know who those people are. I don't have to do anything. And the next thing that happens is they get a judgment against you, and then they try to collect by garnishing your wages. So the whole debt buying industry, to a large degree, relies on you as the consumer doing nothing if they try to collect from you.
So, for instance, what may happen in a debt buying case is there may be some credit card debt that Chase or American Express or whoever considers bad debt, and they'll sell that off to someone else. And they may sell, let's say, $10 million of a debt for pennies on the dollar, right? And that's sort of what someone's doing. They're coming in and purchasing this package of debt, and part of that debt may be expired. And that's one of the things we were going to talk about is expired debt. So tell us, how does that problem get presented when there's these debt buyers purchasing these packages of debt?
Well, and it's pretty clear that there's some debts that they're buying that are time expired. And when we say time expired, what we're talking about is what most people call as the statute of limitations. The statute of limitations bars people from suing you after a period of time. Now, when they buy this debt, the price that they pay for it, actually, that they might buy debt and they might say, look, we just want to buy debt that's time barred, that we think we can collect it. The reason they do that is because the creditor is willing to sell that debt cheaper than other debt. So it might be a lower amount that they're paying for it, but they know right from the start that this debt is old. And then they go try to collect it. So they'll send you letters claiming, do you want to pay this debt? And they offer you savings, saying that you could save money if, that they're going to give you a discount if you pay it now, when in fact they can't even legally enforce the debt. So they're really preying on people, in my opinion, trying to convince them that they should pay this debt when the people don't understand that they're really not obligated at all to pay the debt. It's a real problem and continues to be a problem.
And so how does that work with, let's say a debt's expired, it's beyond the statute of limitations. I guess technically the creditor can't really sue that person for it legally, but I've heard of ways they try to get you to renew the debt, such as making a payment or other things. How does that work, and what's the legal effect of paying on a debt that's already been expired?
And this varies from state to state what the particular laws are, but in some states, for instance, even just saying, let's say they tell you to call in, and you call in and you say, yeah, I know I had this debt, I just can't afford to pay it. In some states, that might be sufficient, where all of a sudden this time-barred debt suddenly becomes enforceable because you acknowledged it. In other places, they require you to go ahead. Let's say the collector says, well, let's just have a good faith payment and send us something. And you send in $10 thinking, well, what's the harm of doing that? Well, in some states, paying that $10 renews the entire debt, and suddenly now you owe it. Now, in other states, it may not affect you, but unless you know what the laws are in your state, talking or paying these debt collectors is probably only going to get you in trouble.
Okay, so if someone has a question about whether they owe a debt, or if they're getting in contact from some company they've never heard of, what do you recommend that a typical consumer do in that instance?
Well, the best thing that they could do, of course, is contact someone who understands. I mean, attorneys who aren't familiar with this area may not know the things that should be said or done. But what I usually tell clients is, if you get a letter from someone, especially if it's time-barred debt, where it's a debt that's, you have to know in your particular state, but if it's an old debt, then the first thing should be to call them. The first thing should be, you should probably try to call an attorney who's familiar with consumer issues in your state. And that's part of the idea behind Law Zebra, is make sure that there's people available for you to call. But talking to the creditor, like I said earlier, could revive the debt. So you just got to be very careful. They didn't loan you the money. They bought it for a few cents on the dollar. All they want to do is collect from you.
Okay, great. So let's switch gears here and talk about another common debt collection practice we've been seeing, which is the grieving spouse debt. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is and what's been going on with that?
Yeah, that's another area that's pretty atrocious in my opinion, because what's happening in the past, most of the time, if someone passed away, the account would be closed and that would be the end of it. Then the next phase was they started filing claims in people's estates, but then they also started selling this debt, either selling it or trying to collect it themselves. And what they've done is they've decided that if they train their collectors specifically for this type of debt, to use psychology to convince you that even if you might not be legally liable, you should pay it anyway. And using sort of, you're talking to someone who's just suffered a loss, and they talk in terms of, well, you don't want to mar the reputation of your spouse who just died. Don't you want to take care of their debts? Things like that. when you're not legally obligated. I just think it's wrong behavior.
So how would someone know, for instance, in Wisconsin, whether that's a legal practice or if they're allowed to do that versus in other states? Is there a difference between some states have common law marriage and those types of things, community property? How does it, I know every state is different, but in general terms, how does that work and what do you look for when someone may contact you to see if they're responsible for their spouse's debt after they've passed?
Sure. The first question would be is whether you're a community property state or not. If you're not a community property state, unless you signed up and made yourself liable for the debt, you're not going to be liable because of some community property law. So there's 9 states that have community property. There's 2 other states where you can opt in to make a community property. What community property says is that once you're married, you're sort of a single unit. You're a single person. So if there's things that are bought for the benefit of the family, both of you could be liable. But even in those states, you still have to examine whether or not it's something that falls within the particular laws of that state that would make you liable simply by being married to the person. So you really have to analyze these things state by state, but also even for the community property states, it doesn't mean you're automatically liable. So the big thing is knowledge is key here. And what happens most of the time is you've got collectors who have all the knowledge, understand, and sort of direct you to places where it's convenient for them because they can collect, and they're relying on the fact that you don't know enough to argue or to say, no, that's just wrong. I don't owe this debt.
And it sounds like they use the fact that you're grieving, you've just lost your spouse, really as leverage to emotionally kind of get you to do what they want, which is pay the debt.
Right. That's all they're doing is they're single-minded. Their goal is to get you to pay this debt. That's all they really care about. And, they'll say things that I think are inappropriate, taking advantage of your situation as far as your emotional state. But they wouldn't do these things if it didn't work. So it works. They get people to pay things that they probably shouldn't be paying. So until people stand up, it's going to continue to happen.
Okay, great. So let's talk about the last topic we're going to talk about today, which is medical debt. And we've seen a lot of things in the news lately about hospitals that used to take people to court on a regular basis in small claims over these debts, now agreeing not to do that. Tell us a little bit about that, and we'll also talk about some of these other issues that have come up specifically with the COVID-19 emergency care, that type of stuff. But let's start first with what's been the recent development here with hospitals as far as debt collection in general.
Okay, so a lot of hospitals have backed off, but there's still others who are still trying to collect, and it gets it depends again on your state. Some states have charity care, so if you really don't have sufficient income to pay these bills, you may not be liable for them. In other states, if it's a nonprofit, the nonprofit has certain obligations to maintain their nonprofit status to provide charity care. So those are sort of the issues. And the real question is whether or not, if you're not making a lot of money and you've got medical bills, there's a pretty good chance you're entitled to some sort of charity care, either under state law or even because the particular hospital that provided the services is a nonprofit. So you need to look into that. The other issue that we're running into is, let's say you go to a hospital in an emergency situation and you end up having surgery, and then the hospital recognizes that you're entitled to charity care. They're not going to send you a bill for their services, but then you get a bill from the surgeon or an anesthesiologist. And they're saying, well, we're not part of the hospital. Well, we disagree with that. We think they are part of the hospital, and the hospital had the obligation to provide you those services, so you shouldn't be liable. So if you're getting billed, and this, by the way, would also apply to this whole thing about in-network or out-of-network, we think the same approach applies, that if you go to a hospital who's supposed to provide you these services and they choose to hire a third party to do it, that doesn't become your problem. That's the hospital's issue.
Great. So for instance, if I have two hospitals in my area and I know one is in my network and one's out of network, I'm going to choose the one that's in network and I go there. So the hospital bill itself may be covered. My insurance might cover that. But what they're doing is the doctor or the radiology or some of these other ancillary services, they're billing you basically out of network, and you could end up paying either dollar for dollar or a majority of that bill when that should have been covered in network and go towards your deductible. Is that sort of what's going on with these?
Right. And when you talk about in-network, out-of-network, besides the fact that they're billing you separate and it might not go towards your deductible, they're probably also charging you a higher rate. Someone who doesn't have, often the times the insurance company has negotiated specific reduced rates for the services provided. So now all of a sudden you're dealing with a surgeon or an anesthesiologist who says they're out of network. So any negotiated rates don't apply to them. So you end up with, not only are you not getting the benefit of making payments towards your deductible, but you're also paying much higher rates, all on the basis that somehow they're out of network, even though the only way you came into contact with these people was going to a network hospital.
Okay, so you may go to that hospital, and for the anesthesia, that they may have a contract with the hospital that says they'll bill you $1,000. Now, if they have an anesthesiologist that's out of your network, they're going to bill for that same service $2,000 or $3,000 under the guise that they don't have a contract, so they're going to bill you for that whole amount. Is that what you've been seeing?
Yeah, that's what's happening, that they're taking the position that they're outside the network, and therefore they're not bound by any network rules. They're not bound by any reduced payments amounts or anything else.
So if someone thinks that they should have qualified for charity care, or that they've gotten something out of network, how do they go about figuring that out? Because I'll tell you honestly, even as a lawyer, trying to figure some of this stuff out with the hospitals and insurance, it is a mess. I mean, constantly we're seeing bills and you can't tell what's been charged, what's been paid by insurance, whether it's in network, out of network. How does a normal consumer who's working, regular job figure this stuff out?
Well, it's really tough. And I think for the hospitals, for instance, what you want to tend to do is go to the hospital that's in your network. Then if you get additional bills from other people and they claim that they're billing you separately or for different amounts because they're out of network, that's when you want to talk to someone about that. That's an area that we deal with. And I want to mention some states, at the moment, like for instance, your state, Wisconsin, passed a law that says if you end up going to a hospital that's outside your network, your insurance company is going to be obligated to pay that hospital as if it was in network. So that's going to be a big issue because, in the current circumstances, you might end up with a situation where you had to go to a hospital that's not in network, and then you're going to get a bill and they're going to tell you how it was out of network, but the law that they passed is going to apply and require the insurance company to pay it as if it was in network.
So if anyone has a question on whether this bill they get from a hospital or their EOB from the insurance company, if they have questions about that, how can they get a hold of a lawyer through the Law Zebra network? What's the easiest way? And I'll put the website on there. Other than contacting Law Zebra through the website, what other ways are there to try to get answers for a consumer?
Well, through us, besides the website, we're also on Facebook. Law Zebra Network is on Facebook. You can get to us through that. Those are the primary ways, is probably the website. There might be other ways in your area, like, there are legal aid societies in various states that provide services for low-income people. That's one thing to look at. But if you need help, most of the work we do is on a contingency basis. And what that means is if we don't win for you, if we don't get you something, you're not going to pay us any money. And even in the states that require it, that means that you're not even going to be liable for costs. So we put our our time and effort where we think it's going to be valuable, and we will be successful for you. Because if we're not successful for you, you're not going to pay us.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us today, Scott. If anyone has any questions about illegal debt practices, medical bill issues, or any other consumer issues, or they just feel like they've been taken advantage of or haven't been treated fairly by a credit card company, your mortgage, anything like that, go to the Law Zebra Network, go to our website, lawzebra.com, and you can get matched with an attorney throughout the nation. We're independent attorneys that have joined together to help consumers. We're happy to answer any questions. So again, Scott, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Bob.